This is a whale. Now, it may not look like a fire-breathing, flying reptile, but that's because you haven't removed all of its flesh. Already, this looks more like a mythical monster, but to add to the effect, consider two things. First, that you found this skeleton not washed up on the beach, but thousands of miles from the nearest water source in the middle of the desert. And the whale in question is not a modern whale, but one of the earlier whale ancestors that were a little bit more legged. If some guy a few thousand years ago happened to be the one that stumbled onto it, they probably aren't thinking that this is an ocean titan, but an ancient beast that roamed the land. And this is only one of an endless number of examples that could have started the myth of dragons. Pretty much every culture eventually came up with a mythical creature that is some flavor of dragon. Either somebody found a fossil of one of the very real giant reptiles or other massive critters that roamed the earth, or they simply imagined how scary it would be if one of the local lizards was building size. No matter the case, dragons are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Since I was a kid, I was absolutely fascinated by dragons, and for a frankly embarrassing amount of time, I was entirely convinced that they were real. This was probably helped along by this book, which also took me an equally embarrassing amount of time to realize was fiction and didn't contain actual dragon skin. You'd think the glitter would have been a giveaway, but no. Finding out dragons weren't real was absolutely crushing. My disappointment was immeasurable, and my life was ruined. And considering the only thing that I wanted more than dragons was to grow up to be a wizard, I was on a path for further disappointment. Or so I thought. Imagine my surprise when I grew up to be as close to a real wizard as you can get, and through many years of study, learned to rewrite DNA like it's Python code. This video is the first episode of what we're calling our Making Monsters series, where we take a monster from fiction and see what it would take to make it real. We're going to explore the very real chemistry, biology, and ecology of these monsters, and we're not limited to classical myth. Of course, dragons and vampires and the like are on the table, but so is Shai-Hulud, xenomorphs, and more. And if there's a monster you want to see us dissect and figure out its function, be sure to leave a comment below.
And in this corner, Zoidberg! Come on, lighten up! What is this, a funeral?
But without further ado, let's talk dragons. As I said, the varieties of dragons through both myth and popular culture are nearly endless. There's your classical big scaly fire dragon, but just the same, you've got wiggly worm dragons, ice dragons, dragons that spit poison, dragons that hoard gold, big dragons, little dragons, fluffy dragons, peaceful dragons, evil dragons, magic dragons, and even slut dragons. But we don't talk about those. In my mind, there are a few things that separate dragons from your standard reptile. The first is obviously the ability to spit fire or some other deadly substance. There's also usually the ability to fly, though sea dragons often can't. They also need claws, scales, and big ol' teeth, which means no vegetarian dragons, only carnivores. Dragons are always top predators. Beyond that, it's pretty variable. Sometimes hair, sometimes not. Sometimes highly intelligent, sometimes big dumb reptile. And magic is obviously a no-go unless we can teach an overgrown flammable iguana how to do card tricks. Since dragons are very much a creature of Earth, we're going to say that they have to abide by Earth's animal rules. For example, while many depictions of a dragon show them as having 4 limbs plus 2 wings, yeah, this quite literally isn't going to fly. The only animals that have more than 4 limbs are arthropods, so unless we make a lot more headway on our giant insect project that we posted recently, I'm going to say that dragons are not a species of insect and thus have 4 or fewer limbs. When we talk about genetic control of body size in a moment, we'll see how we can cause an extra set of limbs to develop, but they don't just magically sprout out of the back where you want them. Instead, the extra set of limbs would end up further down the body. This would end up looking very weird in a flying reptile, and would seriously mess with both the center of mass and the functions of the muscles and how they attach to the skeleton. Flight muscles need to anchor on the sternum as they need to be huge, which means a weirdly long sternum or double sternum and keel. As such, we're going to stick with what has been proven to work very well over the past several 100 million years, and only have 4 limbs. We're also going to say that dragons can only have 1 head. There are no vertebrate animals on Earth with more than 1 head, other than the odd birth defect, and for good reason. While some conjoined twins can hear each other's thoughts because, well, their brains are physically connected, 2 separate heads can't communicate like that, and so wouldn't be able to properly control a body. So the zippleback and also hydra, which are a dragon subspecies, are both hard ruled out. So, for any of our flying dragons, the wings can only be made 2 ways. Convert the front set of limbs into wings, or make the wings out of something else. For example, the aptly named Draco family of lizards evolved to have a few massively extended ribs, and accompanying skin flap, which can be extended for gliding. And they are excellent flyers, just so long as they have a tall thing to jump off of. And of course, there are a host of gliding animals that simply evolved extra skin between their limbs to allow for gliding. Now, don't get me wrong, the idea of what is basically a T-Rex with a built-in hang glider does sound terrifying. But the bigger you are, the more wingspan you need, so at proper dragon size, they almost certainly won't be getting enough lift to glide for very long. Maybe just swooping down a hill. Still scary, but not what we're going for.
This isn't flying, this is falling with style.
So, while I think this could work for small species of dragon, we need something else if we want a creature that can circle ominously and fly away with your sheep. Because otherwise, we're just taking a Draco lizard and making it breathe fire. If we go with converting the front set of limbs, this is actually a pretty classic dragon form, usually called a wyvern or wyrm. One of the weird things in nature is that essentially every animal you see has the same bones. Evolution has just smeared and shifted the basic body plan around to get all of the endless and marvelously weird forms that we find, both alive and extinct. So a horse and a chimp and a beaver and a bird and a whale all share the same basic bone pattern. As such, we have a few options for how we distort the front limbs to make our wings. In avian dinosaurs, all of the metacarpals that would have made the palm of your hand have all been smushed together. As have most of the fingers, except a little bit of thumb and a bit of pinky to support that last third of the wing. Bats, on the other hand, use all of their fingers and fly by basically endlessly high-fiving the air. And finally, pterosaurs were somewhere in the middle, with one really long finger but not the rest of the hand. All of these options are good, but none of them actually leave the dragon with any kind of dexterity with their wings. If we want to improve this a little and give them +2 dex, there is the Hotzen buff that we could explore. Before birds had completely turned their hands into wings, many still had a few claws mixed in with all of those feathers. And there's a species of bird still alive today that has very prominent claws on its wings that allow it to climb and grapple things. The largest ever flying reptile, the Quetzalcoatlus, had this same sort of arrangement and had a few fingers to go with their massive wings, though it's anyone's guess how dexterous they really were.
What's going on? Why aren't you seizing the boy?
No matter which we choose, there are a few consequences of being a flying animal, especially a big one. First, mass is the enemy, so they would need extra strong yet hollow bones, just like birds. And bird bones aren't just hollow, they're actually connected to the amazing lung system that birds have, providing even more air volume. Speaking of which, we've got to use bird lungs for our dragon, they're just too good to pass up. Unlike our pathetic lungs that simply suck air in and out, bird lungs work in 2 stages. It actually takes multiple breaths for the air to go all the way through them. In humans, our diaphragm muscle forces the lungs to expand, sucking in air. But birds don't have a diaphragm. Instead, their lungs are connected to usually 9 air sacs, which can be expanded or contracted. The lungs themselves don't change size like ours do, and the flow of air is controlled entirely by the connected air sacs. So when a bird takes a breath, air passes through a shortcut that basically bypasses the lungs and fills the posterior air sacs. When they exhale, the posterior sacs contract and the anterior ones expand. This pulls the air through the actually vascularized part of the lungs, so gas exchange happens. But notice the air hasn't left the bird yet. It's just been shuffled from the back to the front. So on the next breath, the posterior sacs fill up again, and on the next exhale, the now very stale air in the anterior sacs is forced out and replaced with air from the posterior sacs. This means that gas is always moving in a continuous flow, and old stale air doesn't get mixed in with the incoming fresh air. And the veins can run from lowest to highest oxygen content to maximize extraction. This allows the bird to extract a lot more oxygen out of the air than we do. And, as an added bonus, the air sacs connect to their hollow bones. Not only does this reduce mass further, it also gives birds a way to shed heat efficiently. Essentially, their bodies are air-cooled from the inside out. This makes flight even more efficient, so yeah, we're definitely using bird lungs for dragons. There is, however, one last option for flight that we should explore before we move on. Dragons from China and other parts of Asia often have no wings at all but still fly. Or they have little wings but keep the relatively serpentious form. Essentially, the only way this is possible is if the majority of their bodies were filled with gas bladders. If the animal could maintain a sufficient quantity of hydrogen in their body while keeping their weight as low as possible, it might be possible to make a micro meat zeppelin with teeth. The idea of a gas bladder isn't even that far-fetched. Most fish have gas bladders to maintain neutral buoyancy, so there's nothing to say that a gas bladder couldn't be used to offset some mass. Unfortunately, with how thin the atmosphere is, the amount of gas needed to lift even a small amount of mass gets quickly out of control. To illustrate this point, meet Lawn Chair Larry, a man that decided to hell with the ground, I'm taking a stroll through the sky. And after loading up his trusty BB gun as literally his only way to stop his ascent, climbed onto a lawn chair to which he had tied a few dozen extra-large helium balloons. By comparing the amount of mass to volume here, you can see the trouble with a dragon that floats with gas. So for this to work, we pretty aggressively need to min-max parts of the anatomy. All of the organs would need to be sequestered and densely packed under the length of the spine, and everything would need to be as light and small as possible. And like a snake, you would significantly increase the number of ribs. However, instead of dense muscle for constricting, you actually need to thin the flesh out as much as possible, with just enough muscle to prevent the whole tube from becoming a wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. And every bone would need to be thin and light. And of course, as much of the body cavity as possible would be taken up by one or more gas bladders filled with hydrogen. Though we'll come back to how they would make that hydrogen in a moment when we talk about fire-breathing options. And of course, if they were to use any of their gas reserve for fire-breathing, they now risk falling out of the air. Not to mention the immense fire hazard of literally being a hydrogen balloon. However, this is the only case where adding extra limbs to add wings does kind of make sense. With a long, floaty body, they would need a way to maneuver in the air, so some very lightweight wings to help swim through the air would be pretty helpful. And with a long, snake-like body, adding a few extra vertebrae was already going to be part of the plan, so an extra body segment or two with limbs on it isn't too much to ask. Though, we do need to be cognizant of the balance of a floating dragon. With a spine on top and gas bladders along the ventral side, we do run the risk of the bladders flipping the dragon upside down. And while this can be controlled using a counterweight, there's nothing to say that an upside-down animal is forbidden. For example, there is a species of catfish, aptly called the upside-down catfish, that lives its whole life, well, upside down. And there are also jellyfish that do this as well, living their lives at the bottom of the ocean instead of floating around. So Mushu might have been both blimp-like and inverted unless we accounted for that. And with a belly full of hydrogen, he's even more of a fire hazard than he already was. By the way, if you've been enjoying our derpy dragons as much as we do, we loved them so much that we decided to really go all out on a merch drop. We've got new t-shirts and mugs, of course, but also these adorable pillows and plushy keychains, so you can give these derpy dudes the real snuggle they deserve. And we can't forget this amazing new poster showing off dragon anatomy and how they work. You can find it all at thethought-emporium.ca, and use the coupon code WHALEBONES for 5% off your order. Also, you may have noticed all the artwork in the video so far, and importantly, that none of it was made with AI. We've decided that this year we are removing all use of AI from our work and instead spending more on real human artists. And while that is more expensive, we think it's absolutely been worth it. If you want to help support us in doing this for more future videos, consider becoming a patron of the channel so we can hire even more amazing artists. Now, before we bust out the chemicals and start exploring our fire-breathing options, let's talk about how we would actually go about implementing changes to the shape of an animal to deform it into a dragon. There's really two different control loops to talk about. There's control of body size and mass, and then there's the actual control of shape. Size is the easier of the two because pretty much all vertebrates work on the same basic system. It's controlled by two variables, genetics and nutrient availability. Without the right food, it doesn't matter how good your genes are, you can't grow. But assuming ample food, and we'll talk about the eating habits of dragons shortly, the main control on size is going to be the growth hormone network. Growth hormone is one of a group of molecules produced by the pituitary gland, which is located in the brain. During the juvenile period, the amount of hormone released by the gland sets how big the body can get. There's also gonadotropin, growth hormone releasing hormone, insulin-like growth factor 1, ghrelin, and a few others. This is why people with gigantism frequently have pituitary tumors or other lesions that cause the gland to be overactive. If it never stops secreting hormones, you get really, really big. However, if it doesn't put out enough, you stay tiny. The various hormones all interact, and you need to maintain a pretty delicate balance of them to continue the growth cycle without breaking things. And whatever species you start with is going to have slightly different sensitivities to each, so this has to be well calibrated. When I was a kid, there were a few very short kids in my class, but their parents were loaded, so they could pay their way around bad genetics without having to change a single letter of DNA. And so they paid to have them injected with growth hormone to be artificially taller than they otherwise would have ended up. And they ended up taller than me. But it's not as simple as just cranking the levels of these hormones. In a study comparing the genetics of differently sized species of snake, it wasn't just the growth hormone network that showed changes with increasing animal size. There were also big changes in genes related to digestion, metabolism, respiration and oxygen retention, as well as immune function. And in very large animals, we often see tweaks that increase cancer resistance, as more cells means more opportunity for cancer. Also, some of the changes to their genetics don't affect growth hormone levels at all, but instead adjust genes that are crucial to embryo formation and cell division. So the embryos themselves will develop more cells to start with. That way there's more material to work with when the juvenile period kicks off. And making cells more likely to divide means you get inherently more growth when a growth trigger comes. And all this makes sense, right? The bigger you are, the more important food is, and needing to squeeze every bit of energy out of your food. And you've got more volume for microbes and parasites to infect, so you need a stronger immune system. So our dragons would need anywhere from 20 to maybe more than 200 tweaks to various genes just to make them bigger, and a similar number to do a rework on the various internal systems so they don't die before you can get to full size. We would also want to enhance the function of their kidneys and liver, as the bigger you are, the more waste you need to process. And since our dragons are carnivores, there's a lot of carnivores we can draw from to adjust their metabolism, to account for a very high meat and fat diet. And while we're in there, we're going to want to increase the size of the pancreas and adjust the enzymes that are released into the bile sac to account for lots of cooked meats. We'd likely want to take notes from bears, as they often have bile specifically suited to eating very fatty meat in huge quantities. But with that done, we can start to reshape the body to be more dragon-like. To start off, we need to talk about Hox genes. No, not Hox genes, not Box genes, not Lox genes, not Fox genes, Hox genes. Have you ever wondered how an embryo knows which side is supposed to be the head and which side is supposed to be the butthole? And how a little blob of cells can figure out where the legs go? Well, a huge amount of that is thanks to the Hox system. This is one of the most ancestral gene systems that we carry with us, so much so that pretty much every animal on Earth uses a version of it. The Hox system started as a single gene set that over millions of years and across species has gone through many duplication events. The more Hox genes you have available, the more you can fine-tune the process. So flies, being very simple animals, have one relatively short Hox cassette with less than 10 main genes, whereas humans have 4 sets with a total of 39 genes. Each Hox cassette is a long stretch of DNA with a series of genes pretty much in the order that they're going to be used in. When an embryo is first forming, only the first gene is turned on. As the cells grow and divide, the embryo begins to elongate and the next genes start to turn on, and earlier ones turn off, but only in the newly growing section. This repeats down the whole length of the embryo. The result is that each set of genes is only expressed in specific body segments. I won't get into the weeds of exactly how this network works, because honestly that would be a massive topic in and of itself, but the most important part of this are morphogens. Morphogens are chemicals that cells use to communicate and detect distances. In our recent video about human cloning, one of the things we talked about was how a growing stem of a plant knows when to make a new leaf. The cells at the base of each leaf emit a hormone, which can only diffuse a very short distance down the length of the branch. As the branch grows longer, eventually the level of hormone being received by the tip of the branch drops below a threshold, and that triggers a new leaf to form. This is a classic example of a morphogen network. With Hox genes, one of the many genes they turn on are specific morphogens that begin to be released, as well as receptors to detect them. As the body grows, the cells at the leading edge are detecting the various hormones, while emitting different ones of their own. When they've grown enough that the hormone level being received drops, it triggers the next set of genes to turn on. And with signal coming from the back and the front, the cells in the middle can also tell where they are. It's these signals that label each little section of the body, and the Hox genes that are expressed in each section go on to affect dozens or hundreds of other genes, turning some on or off. This allows subsections of the program to run that control the formation of specific body parts, like the legs or wings, and the control of the shape of those pieces is again done using morphogens. It's a delicate dance, and messing with it causes all kinds of weirdness to happen. Even just changing how long a specific Hox gene stays on can have a huge effect on the body. For example, the difference between a lizard and a snake. Normally, Hox 9 marks the end of the ribcage, and Hox 10 controls areas that deal with the lower spine. Then 11 and 13 mark the hips and tail. In snakes, Hox 9 stays on for a super long time, so the spine keeps making more and more vertebrae until the gene turns off and Hox 10 runs. And by having a mutant version of Hox 6, you get ribs down the entire length of that spine. And as you can see from this image, part of the reason we know that is because we tested out mutant versions in mice to see what they do. One common theme in all of these circuits, though, is that they often work in cycles with other genes to form a sort of clock. In our recent video going over the basics of genetic engineering, we explored one such gene circuit called the repressilator, and we saw how wiring 3 genes into a loop is the equivalent of having 3 transistors connected into a loop. Long as they have power, the cycle will continue forever on its own. So, in a snake, one of the ways that they get that dramatically longer spine is that there is a clock circuit that oscillates between tissue that should make bone and tissue that should be flesh. The bone bits are called somites. In things with a normal spine, the clock in charge of this section runs slower. Combine that with a shorter period with the correct Hox gene active, and you end up with a normal-looking skeleton. But mess with that clock and the Hox timing, and bits of the body start to get super long. And we actually see the exact same effect in the so-called long-tailed lizard, only it affects a different Hox segment. We also see the same thing in fingers, where if you mess with the clock, it overcounts, and you go from 5 fingers to many, and eventually end up with something that looks much more like the beginnings of a fish's fin. Also, remember how I mentioned we can double up a body segment to add extra limbs? Well, this is done extensively in arthropods, and if you mess with something like a fly, you can get a whole extra thorax and set of wings. And if you mess with the subprograms, you can swap bits around, like making legs grow where the antenna should have been. Though, of course, doing this on purpose and with grace is much easier said than done. Most of these weird flies were initially found by mutating them randomly and then sequencing the weird broken ones. Then you reintroduce the same mutation into an otherwise normal fly to see if it consistently has the same effect. So you're going to want to start your dragon making process with a thing that is as close to the final shape that you want as possible, and then expect a whole bunch of debugging time. Thankfully, there are some really top-notch lizards that look most of the way there. So most of the focus really would just be getting the Hawk's cassettes from birds or bats to work in the arm section of lizards, and then fine-tuning it. And then we can finally work on the fire-breathing and other dangerous spray options. That's right, we're more than 20 minutes into a dragon video and haven't set anything on fire yet. Criminal, I know, so let's rectify that. Thankfully, biology does not actually have a problem making highly flammable gases. Both hydrogen and methane are produced by bacteria and other microbes very readily. You can even buy what's so-called a biogas fermenter, where you put food scraps in, and microbes turn it into a high-quality natural gas that you can run your stove off of. These same microbes will happily live inside animals too. Sometimes when a cow develops a blockage, the grass fermenting in their gut gets trapped with nowhere to go. So the only solution is to pop a hole in the cow with a big needle, and out comes a ton of gas that is really easy to ignite. So a dragon could use fermentation in a chambered stomach to produce some amount of flammable gas, though then they would probably need to eat plants for fuel, which is no good. Or their cells could be convinced to release molecular hydrogen fairly easily. But the truth is, counterintuitive as it may seem, gases make terrible flamethrowers. Let me demonstrate. This is a propane torch for a forge. It's designed to burn a huge amount of gas and get really hot. And yeah, it shoots out a huge flame. But huge is relative. And while I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of this, I don't actually have to be that far away from it to be safe. Even the really big gas flamethrowers that they use at concerts don't throw the flame that far, and usually get the advantage by shooting straight up. Compare that with the US military M22. This uses a gelled liquid fuel instead of a gas. And while it does have some gas in it, it's not to burn. It's just to use to pressurize that fluid and squirt it out, allowing you to comfortably light innocent civilians on fire from nearly 100 meters away.
But we have flamethrowers, and what this indicates to me, it means that at some point, some person said to himself, "Gee, I sure would like to set those people on fire over there, but I'm way too far away to get the job done. If only I had something that would throw flame on them."
For this to work in a dragon, it would need to produce a thin, flammable oil, something like octanol, to act as the fuel, as well as stearic acid to act as the thickener. It would be stored in a bile sac or other flame bladder, and this isn't actually that difficult to do chemically. Unlike traditional chemistry, where you need super horrifying reagents and big, complex apparatus to do simple chemical reactions, biology sidesteps all of that. Instead of the usual toxic reagents, your principal tool in biology are enzymes. These amazing molecules can physically grab two other molecules and shove them together to make them perform a chemical reaction. Or, just the same, grab one and rip it apart. So, by finding and expressing specific enzymes in your organism of choice, you can make complex molecules relatively easily. Though for this to work well, the metabolism of the cells in question usually needs to be tweaked. And in the context of a whole animal, you need to make sure that the blood and metabolism of that whole animal can consistently deliver the required feedstock in sufficient quantity. Anyway, specifically making octanol has been done many times in E. coli, and we even talked about that pathway on an old genetic engineering stream we did a few years ago. And stearic acid is just a long fatty acid, and all organisms have mechanisms for making large fats. You just need to tweak the enzymes that make the heaviest fats to overproduce. In fact, bodies already do this. All over your skin are sebaceous glands that produce and excrete a waxy mixture of oil and fats. You could reuse this structure, connected to a flame bladder for both the octanol and fatty acid production and excretion. Not unlike how a mammary gland works, but dramatically less healthy for a baby. But with a belly full of flammable oil, we have two problems to address. First, how do we get it out of the dragon? And more importantly, how do we actually start the fire? Gelled fuel is great, but without something to light it, it's just a stinky, sticky mess. Our first thought to fix both problems was a hypergolic mixture. Basically, this means two chemicals that burst into flames the second they're mixed. It's what's used in the engines of most missiles, as well as the thrusters that are used in space. When you can't rely on a spark or starter, they're the perfect solution. Probably the most classic is the reaction between fuming nitric acid and, well, honestly, almost any flammable liquid. Case in point, the traditional test to see if your acid is strong enough is to dribble some on a pair of lab gloves and see if they burst into flames. Truly, this is nasty stuff. So in theory, this would work really well. There's just one tiny problem. Fuming nitric acid would destroy literally any molecule that biology can make, and then turn it into soup, and then light it on fire, or explode, or both. As far as we know, you can't make Teflon biologically, so we're going to need some other hypergolic mixture that biology can both make and handle. Luckily, there's a beetle's butthole that contains the answer to our problem. This is the bombardier beetle, and its magnificent butt can spray out caustic chemicals at near boiling temperature. It uses a hypergolic mixture based on hydrogen peroxide. Now, supposedly the way this works is by reacting hydrogen peroxide with hydroquinone, but if you buy the two chemicals and mix them, nothing happens. Supposedly the reaction chamber in the beetle's butt has enzymes that catalyze the reaction to make it start, but we can approximate the same thing by using manganese dioxide scraped out of an old battery. The second that some manganese touches the peroxide, it goes from a calm room temperature liquid to instantly boiling, and the amount of heat that comes off this is truly astounding. And give it enough catalyst and you get a magnificent plume of oxygen and steam. Inside the beetle, this propels the caustic mixture at whoever pissed the beetle off. And it's got a prehensile butthole, so it can take aim and spray wherever it wants. Isn't nature beautiful? For our dragons, this is almost perfect. It could be used to generate the propellant gas to eject out a charge of flammable fuel, or the fuel could be squeezed out with muscles into a stream of gas produced by this reaction to atomize it, and mix in a bunch of oxygen. But even though this is super close to being good, all of these flammable, hot chemicals probably still won't ignite. All fuels have what's called an autoignition temperature. This is the temperature at which, as the name implies, they will spontaneously burst into flames. And octanol, while it's an excellent fuel, does not autoignite at the temperature of boiling water. For this to ignite, we need one last ingredient. Something so ridiculously flammable that even this reaction would set it off. And for that, we look to this pretty flower, aptly called the gas plant, or Dictamus albus. This flower produces so much flammable gas that holding a lighter near it sets off a burst of flames. These flowers are one of many species that use fire to their advantage, and have evolved to be as easy to ignite as physically possible. The trick to this is a chemical called isoprene. This is actually the same chemical used to make synthetic rubber, and it's crazy reactive, both with oxygen and itself. Already, isoprene has an autoignition temperature that is lower than pretty much anything else you're going to find in nature, of only about 230 degrees Celsius. But if you get enough of it in one place, it starts to self-polymerize and get hot enough to autoignite. And with a flash point of minus 48 degrees, it'll burn almost anywhere on Earth. The gas plant actually has a unique mechanism for making isoprene. Most plants produce some amount of isoprene directly through an enzyme called isoprene synthase, but the gas plant uses a different mechanism to increase its yield dramatically. Instead of constantly synthesizing and releasing the gas, it instead makes a chemical called dictogymnin. This chemical is very oily, and the plant can make a lot of it. But when dictogymnin gets above 34 degrees, it starts to rapidly degrade into a massive cloud of isoprene. So for our dragons, we could take from the bombardier beetle and add a third bladder, one filled with dictogymnin. This would rapidly produce isoprene, and the hydrogen peroxide will also react with it to speed the reaction even further. All told, it should provide a flame ignition source and auto-ignite when the reactants are mixed. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a place that sold dictogymnin, so I can't actually test this myself, but if somebody knows where to get some, I'll happily try it. That all said, there is a less complicated way to ignite flammable material, and that is of course a spark. Unfortunately, there's no way that an animal can produce a high enough voltage to arc through the air. Even an electric eel, whose almost entire body is one giant electricity generating organ, can only get up to about 500 volts. More than enough to kill you, but nowhere close to making a visible arc needed to light a fire. So that leaves us with striking an arc the old-fashioned way. Now, the really boring option would be that dragons don't naturally have sparky rocks to start with, and would have to go out and swallow some. This isn't that strange, as most birds don't have teeth, and instead swallow stones, which get trapped in a special muscular stomach called a gizzard. The stones can then swish around and mash up whatever the bird ate. Having basically a fire gizzard, or maybe a pouch in its mouth, is totally an option, but I don't really find that satisfying. For one, you're not magically guaranteed to find rocks that will spark properly. There's only a small subset that will produce a useful spark, so while I suppose it's possible that a young dragon's first quest would be to fly around and find the perfect rock, much like your average magpie, it would still be pretty limiting. I think what would be much better would be to make the teeth spark directly, though this comes with its own challenges. As I said, only specific rock types will spark, and the hydroxyapatite and dentin of teeth is definitely not one of them. Instead, we need iron. A traditional flint and steel works because flint is hard enough to scrape tiny pieces of steel and fling that powder at what you want to ignite. When iron is finely divided enough, it is wildly pyrophoric and will readily burn, which is what we see as sparks. You can do the same thing with pyrite or other iron sulfide minerals. Smack it with a piece of quartz and the iron sulfide pieces get so hot that they quickly oxidize and burn. Thankfully, it's very possible to grow iron sulfide biochemically, and there are actually a variety of sources of it. There are some snails that live near hydrothermal vents whose shell contain high levels of it, and there are even proteins in your eyeball that have a core of iron sulfide. And it's not even unusual to use iron specifically to modify teeth. For example, my favorite animal, the beaver, has bright orange teeth that it uses to literally bite trees in half. Though of course, they take little bites. If we look closer at their teeth, we see that the orange staining of iron is confined only to the front surface. This is so that the softer white parts erode away first, leaving the harder iron bits sticking out as a self-sharpening chisel. The way beavers manage this is with a protein called ferritin. This is a super cool protein complex that self-assembles 20 identical units into a perfect ball. And at the junction between protein subunits is a built-in pump that automagically forces any dissolved iron it encounters into the hollow space inside the ball. This way, iron is naturally hyperaccumulated in these proteins. By massively overexpressing ferritin in the front parts of their teeth, as well as the addition of special transport pumps to help move iron from the blood into cells for storage, you can get very significant amounts of iron to dope the teeth with. It would take a bit of protein engineering, but it also wouldn't be unreasonable to have a small amount of hydrogen sulfide produced inside the cells by breaking down sulfur-containing amino acids to convert the iron into iron sulfide. So the teeth, instead of being orange, would either be shiny black or gold. And flint is really just silica, and again, biology has all kinds of mechanisms for trafficking and mineralizing silica. So you basically just do the same trick, but with silica instead of iron to the top teeth. And just like that, you've got a hard layer and a flammable layer. As long as the dragon had teeth that could be pulled apart or smashed together in such a way to grind and create sparks, a jet of flammable liquid from its gullet and we've got our fire breather. In either case, regardless of if we're using a hypergolic trimix or sparks, we finally have a fire-breathing lizard. And a little bit of Hawk's tinkering, and we've got wings, maybe even with claws. Now, before we wrap up with some dragon ecology, let's quickly see what else we can do with this system we've designed. Much like a paint sprayer with a Venturi pot, we can use our hypergolics to push out something flammable. There's also nothing to say that we couldn't use it to eject acid or poison or something similar instead. Hydroquinone on its own is a little bit caustic, which is why the bombardier beetle uses it, but concentrated stomach acid would be actually pretty dangerous. Doubly so if it's both caustic and poisonous, and there are endless poisons in nature, so really it's dealer's choice as to which to pick. A nice mouthful of cone snail venom, for example, would be pretty lethal. An ice dragon would be harder, since you can't shoot cold, and making liquid nitrogen biologically is not happening. But there's nothing to say that a sea dragon that lives in the Arctic couldn't shoot a stream of pre-chilled ocean water at something flying overhead to cause instant ice buildup and a crash. Just the same, if a dragon had an electric organ, like an electric eel or ray, it may not shoot out lightning, but it could shoot out electrified brine. As Alan Pan demonstrated years ago, a brine solution is plenty capable of conducting a high voltage several feet towards a target. And while Alan used guar gum to thicken his brine to allow for a continuous jet to fly further, there's lots of thickeners in nature that we could use instead. Probably the best for this would be hagfish slime. Now, hagfish are horrible creatures, and part of their ick factor is their defense mechanism, which is to exude a protein that quickly turns into a very thick, gross slime. And pretty much nothing wants to eat that slime, let alone being able to even get a grip on it. So a dollop of that mixed into the saliva of a water dragon and a big electric organ, and you've got the closest you're going to get to lightning breath. Finally, before we talk about the result of releasing our newly minted dragons into the world, there's one last detail to quickly discuss. Scales. Most people know that two sorts of critters tend to have scales: fish and reptiles. But the thing is, most people assume that both things work the same way. Fish scales are removable and are individually anchored to the body of the fish. So in fiction, dragons are often depicted as having nearly indestructible scales that they can shed. But that's not actually how reptiles work. Take my adorable pet noodle, named Linguini, for example. His scales are literally his skin. There is no separation between the two. They don't come off individually. And you can see that from his shed skin. Reptiles have an extra kind of keratin than we do, and so they can make their skin hard enough to act like body armor. And they make bits stick out enough to behave like scales. So while we can go in and strengthen these by mixing in stronger proteins like spider silk, we shouldn't make them hard or the animal would be unable to shed properly. It would be much easier to just thicken the skin and toughen it up while increasing the healing ability than it would be to harden the scales enough to not take the damage. Alright, with that done, we now have a selection of dragons we can release upon the world. And I mean, everyone keeps complaining about loss of biodiversity, so here, some new biodiversity!
Is that the surprise?
No.
That looks like a meat dragon. Did you finish your meat dragon, Carl?
Maybe.
It's horrifying, Carl.
Thank you.
Well, just like the dragons from How to Train Your Dragon, each species and subspecies would end up adapting to different environments, and their prey and eating habits would vary. Much like cats, dragons would be capable of eating anything and killing anything their size or smaller. But with their massive weapon toolset, be it fire, poison, or otherwise, even larger animals would still be preyed on. And the largest dragons would end up preying on smaller ones, along with the rest of the wildlife in the area. Whereas small dragons may either chase small prey or maybe even hunt in packs. And, of course, the real benefit to being a fire-breathing dragon is that they can instantly cook its food. This means a lot more nutrient availability, so they can grow bigger. But just the same, much like some species of hawks that will grab flaming branches to spread forest fires, they may use fire to encourage their prey to flee an area, thus making them easy pickings. But they would need to be careful if they develop a taste for fish, as we've released a few monsters into the sea too. The lightning dragons could quite easily stun other species that happen to be flying overhead, and then finish them off once they're in the water. And Arctic dragons could pick off small seabirds and smaller dragon species for a nice snack. The hoarding of gold, though, would be harder to explain. One reason could be the need for very high levels of iron in their diet to maintain their teeth. If they got into the habit of eating iron-rich rocks, what you often find mixed in with those heavy minerals is gold. Perhaps their stomach acid is dissolving out most of the minerals and just leaving them to shit out the gold. So a new business opportunity for the intrepid adventurers amongst you would be finding and collecting dragon guano to be burned as fuel to free the concentrated gold. Or if they don't excrete gold, maybe they hyperaccumulate it instead. Perhaps that's why dragon eggs are so valuable. The shells may be enriched in gold, so poachers keep trying to collect them. The only question left is who's going to be the first one brave or stupid enough to try and ride one. If people are dumb enough to try and tip over cows, I can't imagine that somebody wouldn't eventually get it in their head that riding the thing would be a great idea. After all, people have tried making bears, elephant, and moose into rideable animals, regardless of the wisdom of that approach. But no matter the case, with dragons spreading to the far corners of the world, I can finally retire to my wizard tower, and know that at least one childhood dream has come true, and fall asleep to the gentle pitter-patter of sheep being abducted. Before you go, as this dragon deep dive demonstrated, learning how things work on the inside can be a lot of fun. And while making dragons may seem wizardly, the truth is that we're surrounded by humanity's finest witchcraft every day. Even your humble toaster is made out of dozens of parts and materials collected from around the world, and you carry around a portal to all of human knowledge in your pocket. But how do these marvels actually work? How did we cram so much science into such a tiny object? Well, over on Nebula, Brian from Real Engineering just started a new series, where in collaboration with LumaField, they take everyday items and stick them into a high-res CT scanner to strip away the outer layers and the mystery of how they function. The first episode starts with the most indestructible piece of tech in history, the Nokia 3310. If you're old enough to have handled one of these, you may have, at one point, wondered why do they bother making tank armor at all when you could just cover a Jeep in these things? Hit them with 1,000,000 volts or drop them from a plane and they barely notice. And with the magic of CT scanning, you can see just what went into making this indestructible brick, with lots more episodes coming and more items to scan. By the way, if you've never heard of Nebula before, it's the amazing streaming service that we've been part of for a few years now. It's an independent platform that is completely free from ads, where you can see our videos and the videos of more than 200 of your favorite creators. Not only do you get to watch our videos ad-free, there's also a ton of bonus content there too. For example, our recent genetic engineering video came with a bonus video explaining how you use a DNA design program and order DNA. And there's bonus content from so many other channels as well, just like Brian's Anatomy of series. There is also a constantly growing collection of amazing originals that can only be found on Nebula, like Abolish Everything. Use my link to get 50% off your Nebula subscription. It's only $30 per year, or about $2.50 per month, which I think is an excellent value. Head over to go.nebula.tv/thethoughtemporium to start watching Anatomy of now. That's all for now, and we'll see you next time.